Welcome to the Sounds of Resistance YouTube channel. The seventh month of the war between Ukraine and Russia turned into a stalemate for the Russian army, the Kremlin administration, and Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is desperately looking for a solution by not accepting the defeats and failure he has received in Ukraine. The war waged by Russian President Vladimir Putin in Ukraine has now brought its own end. Putin started to look for a new way out of the Russian army, which was completely disintegrated as a result of the counterattack of the Ukrainian armed forces in the Kharkiv and Donbas region last week. Putin could not accept this defeat and put into action two moves that would be the beginning of the end. The first of these was the partial mobilization throughout the Russian Federation. For this reason, many Russian men began to leave the country. At the same time, the other was to launch their long-planned referendum in Ukraine. Putin put the referendum card on the table in order to be able to annex the regions he occupied in Ukraine as soon as possible. However, this seems to backfire. The most dangerous of these two moves for Putin was the mobilization throughout the Russian Federation. Hearing Putin's statement on Wednesday, Russian citizens were stunned by panic, anger, and sadness. Hundreds of thousands of Russians, panicking and not wanting to die on the fronts of Ukraine, fled the country. Those who harbored deep anger against Putin, against his regime and his senseless war, started a massive uprising across the country. Especially the societies in the autonomous regions reacted very seriously to this mobilization decision. Chechnya is one of the regions that have reacted. Since the beginning of the Ukrainian war, Chechen leader Kadyrov has regularly sent troops to the Russian front to support Putin. However, Chechens joined the ranks of the Ukrainian armed forces and started the first rebellion. Afterwards, serious public reactions arose in Chechnya. Kadyrov drew the reaction of his own people with his campaigns to support Russia. In fact, in recent weeks, Kadyrov has started to publish small messages that he will resign, because the size of the reactions in Chechnya has started to increase. Chechens, with the idea of freedom ingrained in their bones, were waiting for the weakening of the Russian army. This opportunity has passed into their hands. The Chechens began to think that they could win their freedom against this weak Russian army by fighting against Russia rather than having their own men fight for Russia. There are serious reactions against Putin and Kadyrov not only from Chechen men, but also from women. Military mothers in Chechnya called on the Russians to protest. A woman in Chechnya recorded a message on behalf of mothers who lost their children in the war in Ukraine, urging the Russians to raise their voices against sending men to Ukraine in protests. According to local media, Chechnya is one of the main suppliers of fighters for the war against Ukraine. The author of the voicemail spoke on behalf of Chechen mothers whose children fought or died in Ukraine and called for them to take place in front of the mosque in Grozny to oppose further mobilization in the region. In the published message, it is stated that if Chechen women do not protect their own sons, no one will protect them, and it is questioned why they still send their children to war on behalf of Russia, despite being martyred in the war against Russians twice. This fire will spread and grow. It began to be held in Chechnya for the first time during anti-war protests. Chechnya participated in anti-mobilization actions throughout Russia. This was recorded as the first anti-war protest during Ramzan Kadyrov's rule. Several dozen residents, including military mothers, appeared on the square in Grozny. They urged not to send their children to war in Ukraine. Authorities drove the security forces to the place where the protest was held. Ramzan Akhmadovich Kadyrov accused them of taking money from the West. He also admitted that among the protesters were the mothers of soldiers who were thrown to the front in Ukraine. We know that the protests against the mobilization announced by Russian President Vladimir Putin were put forward by the opposition. Putin declared a partial mobilization to send Russian citizens to war. In a speech, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that in the seventh month of the war with Ukraine, partial mobilization is necessary for the Russian Federation to protect the homeland. So what might Putin be aiming for when he plays the mobilization and referendum trump card? Even though he knew that the Russian people would get such a reaction, his putting this trump card on the table shows us how desperate he is now. However, we need to discuss this issue in more detail. The owner of the Kremlin bunker was faced with the impossibility of achieving by military means the goals of the declared demilitarization of Ukraine and, according to Putin, of denazis. He raised the stakes again in the game of geopolitics and tried to outrun everyone and break the bank. In trying to make a big hit, he also seems to be taking the risk that he might be the biggest loser. Putin's last and biggest bet is an escalation of hostilities and attempt to change the situation on the Russian-Ukrainian front with nuclear blackmail, and an attempt to quickly emerge victorious from the protracted war nonetheless. The recent summit in Samarkand was designed to forget the Kharkiv defeat and humiliation. This summit was a scenario designed to heighten patriotic sentiment and silence angry radical patriots, reinforcing Putin's shattered image as a powerful leader and scavenger of Russian land. That is why Putin is declaring partial mobilization. The State Duma in emergency mode increases criminal responsibility for evading and deserting military service in wartime. In the occupied territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions, the Kremlin is launching a swift campaign to annex Ukrainian territories. The reason they started this is to provide historical justice for themselves. In a televised speech announced Tuesday evening by various anonymous Kremlin sources, Putin said that the main objectives of the military operation have not changed. At the very beginning of these goals was the complete seizure of Donbas by Russia. However, at the moment, considering the difficult situation of the Russian army in the region, partial mobilization was declared and the solution to the soldier problem that Putin could not solve for a long time began. Putin said at the summit that Kiev was trying to divide and destroy Russia. For this reason, it seeks public support in the regions it sees as its own territory throughout the referendum, which is its other important trump card. Finally, the hottest threat of the summit was the nuclear issue, which Putin was talking about. The president of Russia threatened to use all available means in case of a threat to the territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. Putin, who constantly puts this threat on the table, is aware that he cannot profit from this business. However, he's trying to give the message that if I end the whole world, I will finish everyone. Apart from declaring partial mobilization and supporting the holding of a referendum in the occupied territories, Putin has practically said nothing new for either the Russians or the world. It is noteworthy that the Russian president did not say anything about the goals of demilitarization and the denazis in Ukraine, announced on February 24. At this point, we have to pause for a while, because it seems that there are serious inconsistencies between Putin's goal on February 24 and his current goal. On February 24, the Russian president made statements that tried to justify himself in staying away from NATO's territory and said that he intended to send them, describing the administration on Kiev as Nazis. However, at this point, Kiev is not among Putin's goals. This shows us that Putin's goal from the very beginning was to capture the fertile areas in Ukraine and add them to his own lands. The fact that he was able to do this in Crimea in 2014 encouraged him. This time, however, their efforts were completely in vain. Putin's dreams were shattered when Kiev did not surrender quietly and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, like a commander-in-chief at the head of his army, resisted the attack. Thanks to the extraordinary resistance and strategic intelligence of the Ukrainian armed forces, the Russian army was completely defeated. Finally, at the point reached, Putin is struggling not to say he has lost and wants to end the war in the region by seizing the industrial areas of Ukraine, which he has wanted from the very beginning. Putin thought he would win if this war dragged on. But right now, if this war is not over, it is very clear that the end of Putin will come, and Vladimir Putin sees it. Don't get me wrong here, although the success of the Ukrainian warriors plays a huge role in the end of Putin's regime, it is much more likely that Putin will be overthrown by the Russian people or minority autonomous republics such as Chechens. At the moment, the Russian Federation is boiling like a witch's cauldron, and we will see what the coming days will show us. Follow us for our expert analysis, comments, and news.